Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into a core topic in pharmacology, chapter 13, which covers central nervous system depressants and muscle relaxants.
That's right. And if you're heading into clinical practice, well, you absolutely need to understand these drugs. They cover so much anxiety, sleep, even seizures.
Our goal today is pretty straightforward, isn't it? We want to pull out the really crucial need-to-know info from this chapter.
Exactly. We'll look at how they work differently, why some, like benzodiazepines, are generally safer than, say, barbiturates, and critically, what nurses need to watch for to keep patients safe.
Okay, so before we dive into specific drugs, let's set the scene. There's this spectrum of effect, right? A continuum in the CNS.
It starts with sedatives. These calm you down, reduce nervousness, but don't necessarily make you sleep.
Then you have hypnotics, which are stronger, designed specifically to help you fall asleep and stay asleep.
Precisely. More potent CNS effect there, and often a drug can be both, depending on the dose. We call those sedative hypnotics.
Got it. And the key player behind almost all of these, it's GABA, right?
Yes, GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. It's the brain's main brake pedal, the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. These drugs mostly work by making GABA more effective, kind of helping the brain dial down overstimulation. It's fundamental.
Okay, so GABA is key. Now, when we talk about hypnotics, sleep itself comes into play. And it's not just about hours logged, is it? It's about the quality of sleep.
Absolutely. We need to talk about sleep architecture, the natural cycling between NREM and REM sleep stages.
And these drugs, they tend to mess with that cycle.
Oh, definitely. They often disrupt it significantly. And that leads to real clinical problems. First, there's REM interference.
Meaning the drug reduces the amount of that crucial REM sleep.
Exactly. So someone might technically sleep for 8 hours, but they wake up feeling groggy, tired, just unrefreshed because they didn't get enough REM.
That explains a lot. So if the patient says they feel more tired after taking a sleeping pill, that could be why.
That's often a big clue. Might mean the drug needs adjusting, or maybe it's not the right choice. And then there's the flip side if you stop the drug suddenly.
Ah, the rebound effect.
Right, REM rebound. The body tries to catch up on all the REM sleep it missed. This can mean really vivid, sometimes disturbing dreams, or even nightmares, frequent waking. It's why you absolutely cannot stop these meds abruptly. You have to taper.
Okay, super important point. Let's move on to the drugs themselves. First up, benzodiazepines, the benzos, and those newer non-benzodiazepines. These are generally the go-to now, aren't they? Mostly because they're safer.
Generally, yes. Their safety profile is much better than the older classes, like barbiturates.
And how do they actually work? You mentioned GABA earlier.
They work with GABA. Benzos specifically target receptors in certain brain areas, the hypothalamic, thalamic, and limbic systems. Think of them as the GABA facilitators. They bind near GABA receptors and make GABA work better at calming things down.
So compared to the older barbiturates, what makes them safer at a molecular level? What's the big difference?
Well, there are two main things. First, they don't hammer REM sleep quite as hard as barbiturates do. There's still interference, but it's generally less severe.
Okay. And the second?
This one's huge clinically. Benzos don't typically induce those liver microsomal enzymes.
Ah, the enzyme induction issue we see with barbiturates.
Exactly. Barbiturates ramp up those enzymes, then chew up other drugs faster. Benzos don't really do that, which drastically reduces the risk of problematic drug interactions. It's a major safety advantage.
Makes sense. And they're used for quite a range of things, aren't they?
Oh, incredibly versatile. Sedation, obviously. Anxiety release, they're great anxiolytics. Short-term sleep help. Even muscle relaxation.
And in acute situations, too, like seizures.
Yes, definitely. Lorazepam is a common one for stopping active seizures. And then there's midazolam, often used for procedures because it causes amnesia. Patients don't remember the uncomfortable bits, which is a huge benefit.
Okay, sounds good, but there must be downsides, contraindications, risks.
Of course. You can't use them if someone has a known allergy, narrow-angle glaucoma, or during pregnancy. And the main side effects are CNS-related. Confusion, drowsiness, and that lack of coordination we call ataxia.
Let's focus on that drowsiness and ataxia for a second. It sounds mild, but in older adults, that's a different story, isn't it?
It's a massive story.
Yeah.
It translates directly into a significant fall hazard. Older adults often metabolize these drugs more slowly, so the effects are stronger and last longer. A fall can mean a hip fracture, loss of independence. It's serious.
So the rule is always.
Always start with the absolute lowest effective dose in the elderly. Monitor them closely. The risk is just too high otherwise. And watch out for that hangover effect, too, feeling groggy the next day.
Right. Now, You mentioned a better safety profile. What about overdose, toxicity?
This is another key difference from barbiturates. An overdose of just a benzodiazepine on its own rarely causes life-threatening respiratory depression or severe low blood pressure.
Really? So it's usually when other things are involved.
Exactly. The real danger comes when benzos are mixed with other CNS depressants.
Hmm.
Alcohol is the big one, but also opioids, some antidepressants. That combination can be lethal.
But if it is a benzo overdose or too much sedation, there's an antidote.
Yes, thankfully. Flumazenil. It works by kicking the benzo off the receptor site. It directly competes for binding.
And it was fast, like in an emergency.
Oh, yeah. 5-week flumazenil can reverse the sedation very quickly, usually within minutes. It's a vital tool.
Okay. Let's talk interactions. You mentioned alcohol and opioids. What about food? I remember something about grapefruit.
Ah, yes, the classic grapefruit juice interaction. This is critical patient teaching. Grapefruit messes with the liver enzymes, specifically the P450 system, that break down many benzos.
So drinking grapefruit juice means the drug doesn't get cleared properly.
Precisely. The drug levels build up in the body, potentially leading to toxicity or prolonged sedation just from having breakfast.
Wow. Okay. Definitely need to warn patients about that. Any other interactions? Natural products.
Yeah, things like kava and valerian root. They also have CNS depressant effects, so taking them with benzos can lead to additive sedation. Always ask about natural health products.
Good point. And quickly, the non-benzodiazepines like zolpidem or zopiclone, how are they different or maybe better for sleep?
Well, zolpidem, for example, is more selective for certain GABA receptor subtypes thought to be involved mainly in sleep. It also has a shorter half-life.
Meaning less daytime grogginess.
Generally, yes, less of that hangover effect. But they still carry risks, and drugs like zopiclone are often recommended only for short-term use, like 7 to 10 days, to minimize dependence and rebound issues.
Okay, that covers the modern options pretty well. Let's switch gears completely now to the older class. Barbiturates. You've hinted they're riskier. Why?
The main reason boils down to their low therapeutic index.
Explain that. Therapeutic index,
Yeah.
that's the gap between a helpful dose and a harmful dose.
Exactly. And for barbiturates, that gap is dangerously narrow. There's very little room for error between the dose that helps and the dose that causes serious toxicity.
So much easier to accidentally overdose.
Much easier.
Mhm.
Plus, they are physiologically habit-forming. They do work, they depress the CNS, boost GABA, raise the seizure threshold, but their risk profile is why they're used much less now.
And if an overdose does happen, what does that look like?
It's bad. Deep CNS depression, potentially progressing to coma and death. Respiratory depression is severe, sometimes leading to specific patterns like Cheyne-Stokes breathing.
How do you manage that? Is there an antidote like flumazenil?
No specific antidote for barbiturates, unfortunately. Management is all about support. Priority 1 is protecting the airway and supporting breathing, often with mechanical ventilation.
The chapter mentions some specific ways to help clear the drug faster.
Right. Since it's often taken orally, you can give multiple doses of activated charcoal. It binds the drug in the gut and helps pull it out.
Okay.
And for some barbiturates, like phenobarbital, which are acidic, you can actually make the urine more alkaline, urine alkalization, and use forced diuresis. This helps trap the drug in the urine so the kidneys excrete it faster.
Interesting. And therapeutic coma. Using barbiturates intentionally.
Yeah, in very extreme cases, like seizures that just won't stop with other treatments, sometimes high doses of phenobarbital or pentobarbital are used to induce a coma and shut down that excessive brain activity. It's a last resort.
Okay, now let's hammer home that enzyme issue again. Enzyme induction. Why is this such a big deal with barbiturates?
Because they basically tell the liver to build more machinery enzymes to break down drugs. Not just the barbiturate itself, but lots of other drugs the patient might be taking.
So other medications get cleared out too quickly.
Exactly. Think about warfarin, the blood thinner. Barbiturates speed up its breakdown, making it less effective. Suddenly, your patient isn't protected against clots anymore. Risk of stroke, PE, goes way up.
Or birth control.
Same problem. Oral contraceptives can be metabolized too fast, potentially leading to failure and unintended pregnancy. Anytime you start or stop a barbiturate, you have to reassess the doses of all other medications. It's critical.
Definitely a high-stakes interaction. Okay, final drug class for today. Muscle relaxants. Usually for things like back spasms after an injury, right?
Yeah.
Often with physio.
Yep, that's a common use.
Yeah.
Acute muscle spasms.
How do they work? Is it directly on the muscle?
Mostly no. The majority, like cyclobenzaprine or baclofen, are centrally acting. Their main muscle relaxing effect actually comes from their sedative properties. They dampen down nerve activity in the CNS, in the brainstem and spinal cord.
So sedation is key for most of them. You said mostly. Is there an exception?
There is one major exception, dantrolene. It's the only direct-acting muscle relaxant we commonly use.
How does dantrolene work differently?
It acts right inside the muscle fiber itself, reducing the release of calcium. Less calcium means less muscle contraction.
And why is that important? Where is dantrolene used?
Its main critical use is treating malignant hyperthermia. That's a rare but life-threatening reaction, usually to anesthesia, causing extreme muscle rigidity and dangerously high body temperature. Dantrolene is the specific antidote because it directly stops that muscle contraction at the source.
Wow. Okay, so aside from that specific use, muscle relaxants are for general muscle pain, maybe spasticity, like in MS.
Correct. And the side effects are pretty much what you'd expect from centrally acting drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Drowsiness, dizziness, fatigue. Some people feel a bit euphoric. These often lessen over time as someone gets used to the medication.
And toxicity, overdose. Is there an antidote for muscle relaxants?
Nope. Just like barbiturates, there's no specific antidote. If someone takes too much, especially if they mix it with alcohol or other depressants, management is purely supportive. Again, airway and breathing are the absolute priorities.
Okay, we've covered the drugs. Let's bring it all together with the nursing side, clinical application, patient care.
Right, because how we manage patients on these meds is crucial. And the first step always should be non-pharmacological interventions.
Before even thinking about pills.
Absolutely. Things like establishing a regular sleep routine, making sure the bedroom is dark and cool, avoiding caffeine or alcohol close to bedtime, relaxation techniques. These should always be tried first for sleep issues. Meds are backup.
Makes sense. When we do use these meds, assessment is key. You mentioned the sleep diary.
Yeah, the sleep diary is invaluable. Patients often don't accurately recall their sleep patterns. We need to track bedtime, wake times, how many times they woke up, what they ate or drank beforehand, caffeine, alcohol, even those natural products. It gives objective data.
And baseline vitals and neurostatus.
Non-negotiable. Need that baseline neurological assessment. And vitals, especially respiratory rate and blood pressure. Critically, check BP both lying down and standing up to catch any orthostatic hypotension, which ties back to that fall risk.
Good point. Are there any population differences to consider?
Definitely. The text mentions ethnocultural considerations. For example, some studies suggest patients of Chinese descent might metabolize certain benzos differently and may need lower doses. Little things like lactose intolerance might rule out warm milk as a sleep aid. You have to consider the individual.
Okay, implementation. What are the absolute must-do safety instructions for patients on any CNS depressant?
Top ones. No driving or operating heavy machinery until they know how the drug affects them. Always taper off slowly. Never stop abruptly because of rebound or withdrawal. And implement safety measures, side rails up in hospital. Help with walking, especially early on, due to that risk of sedation and ataxia.
Now, for barbiturates like phenobarbital, monitoring is even tighter, right? What are the key points there?
Two critical things. First, therapeutic drug monitoring. Phenobarbital has a narrow window, roughly 10 to 40 micrograms per milliliter. You need to check those levels.
And second,
if you're giving it 5e, the administration rate is absolutely critical. No faster than 1 milligram per kilogram per minute. Pushing it too fast can cause sudden, severe hypotension and respiratory arrest. It's incredibly dangerous.
Got it. Slow push for 5e barbs. What about specific instructions for zolpidem, that non-benzodiazepine?
Yeah, for zolpidem, especially the forms that dissolve under the tongue, the patient needs to take it right before they get into bed on an empty stomach and only when they can dedicate a full 7 to 8 hours to sleep.
Why so specific?
Because if they take it and then stay up, they can have significant short-term memory loss or do things like sleepwalking, even sleep driving, and have no memory of it later. It needs to be taken correctly for safety. So what does this all mean? We've really walked through 3 major groups of drugs that dial down the central nervous system.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Let's recap quickly. We have the benzodiazepines, generally safer for short-term use, versatile, and crucially, they have that antidote, flumazenil. Then the barbiturates, older, potent, but risky due to that low therapeutic index, and the big issue with enzyme induction causing drug interactions. No specific antidote here.
Okay.
And finally, muscle relaxants. Most work centrally through sedation, except for direct-acting dantrolene used for malignant hyperthermia. Again, no specific antidote, so overdose management is supportive.
And the big takeaway message for all of them.
Non-pharmacological first. Always try lifestyle changes and behavioral strategies before reaching for the prescription pad, especially for sleep.
That's a fantastic summary. Okay, for you listening, let's apply this. Think about that case study, PD. The 68-year-old taking alprazolam every night and feeling tired all day. Knowing now about REM interference, the high fall risk in older adults, and the need to taper. How does that change your perspective on using sleep aids long term? It really highlights that managing the consequences of these drugs is just as important as treating the initial symptom, doesn't it? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive, and thank you to the Last Minute Lecture team.